World War II started in 1939, there were two sides, the Allies and the Axis powers. The Allies consisted of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, whereas the Axis powers consisted of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and imperialized Japan. The German political party that came into power was called the Nazis, and they basically put a whole bunch of restrictions on the Jewish population. These were known as the Nuremberg laws, which stated that the Jewish couldn't marry a non-Jew, they couldn't work for a non-Jew, and they basically were stripped of their citizenship. The Nazis' goal was to spread anti-Semitism around the world. They thought this was the only way that the Aryan race was to show that they were superior. They decided to create the final solution, which is also known as the Holocaust. At the beginning of the Holocaust, Nazis forced the Jewish population into ghettos and then from there shipped them off to death and or labor camps. This killed thousands, even millions of the Jewish population that was around Germany. They also targeted the Slavic people, the Polish people, disabled people, and even people who weren't white. So basically Asian and African descended people. They also forced POWs into labor camps. When World War II ended, the Allied powers decided that the horrors that had taken place during the Holocaust were inhumane and criminal. They decided that those who committed the crimes that helped lead to the Holocaust needed to be put to justice. The Allies debated how they should punish the Axis leaders. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, even suggested killing 50 to 10,000 German staff officers. However, Stalin's idea was pushed aside because the United States and Great Britain decided that wasn't the message they were trying to send. In the end, they decided to put all the war criminals to trial. They chose judges from the US, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, and these trials were to take place in Nuremberg, Germany, the town where the Nazi movement started and the laws took away all the Jewish rights. This trial would take place at the Palace of Justice, the only building standing in Nuremberg, Germany. These trials against the war criminals are known as the Nuremberg Trials. On August 6th, the representatives from the Allied countries signed the Charter of International Military Tribunal. This established the laws and procedures that would dictate the format of the Nuremberg trials. 6 days later, a cargo plane carrying most of the major war criminals landed in Nuremberg. Allied military personnel loaded them into an ambulance and took them to a secure block in the Palace of Justice, where they spent the next 14 months. People who were put to justice were political, military, and economic leaders. There were 3 main trials: the major war criminals, doctors' trials, and the Estergruppen trials. These trials exposed horrific events from the war and shed light onto the terrible things that were done to people in these labor camps. In total, there were 33 witnesses that came forth. A French woman who had survived Auschwitz told the court that one night the German soldiers had run out of gas and ended up throwing children into a furnace alive. Another witness stated that he had seen the soldiers make a woman lay down naked in a ditch and then proceeded to shoot them. These testimonies, as well as pictures and footage recovered from World War II, helped the court realize how bad things really were during the war. Altogether, there were 12 different trials, and they were all tried for 4 different categories. They were tried for the participation of conspiracy for the successive war against peace, waging war of aggression and other crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The most famous of these trials, however, was the major war criminals. However, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler committed suicide along with his mistress Eva Braun before they could be captured. Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Goebbels' wife all committed suicide as well. Goebbels took his 6 children with him. His wife explained in the suicide note that she would rather have her children dead than live in post-war Germany with a prosecution against the Nazis. This trial started on October 18, 1945. This trial had 24 major war criminals and 7 criminal organizers, which consisted of the leaders of the Nazi Party, the Reich Cabinet, the SS, the SD, the Gestapo, the SA, and the General Staff and High Command. At the end of the major war criminal trials, 12 were sentenced to death, 7 received different sentences in prison, and 3 were acquitted of everything. Before the hangings, however, Hermann Goldrich and Edward Ritz killed themselves, and the 9 who hadn't committed suicide were put to death by hanging on October 16, 1946. None of the 17 SS officers that worked at Auschwitz received any death penalties. However, they were all convicted and received various jail sentences. The most famous of all these trials came from Hermann Göring. He was the most influential Nazi that had been captured. He had a special rank which made him senior to all other Army and Luftwaffe field marshals. He was also commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. As director of the 4-year plan, Göring bore responsibility for the elimination of Jews from the political life and for the destruction and takeover of the Jewish businesses and property. He was quoted saying, "I wished you had killed 200 Jews and not destroyed such valuable property." He looted art treasures from occupied territories and arranged for the use of slave labor. During his trial, he claimed to not have partaken in any of the rounding up and killing of millions of people. He was a very charming man who at first won over the court. However, he was still sentenced to death. The court stated, "There is nothing to be said in migration, for Göring was often, indeed almost always, the moving force, only second to his leader. He was the leading war aggressor, both as political and as a military leader. He was the director of the slave labor program and the creator of the oppressive program against the Jews and other races, at home and abroad. All of these crimes he has frankly admitted. On some specific cases, there may be conflict of testimony, but in terms of the broad outline, his own admissions are more than significantly wide to be conclusive of his guilt. His guilt is unique in its enormity. The record discloses no excuse for this man." After being found guilty, Göring asked the court to shoot him as a common soldier instead of being hanged as a war criminal. The court declined his request. However, the day before he was set to be hanged, he took his own life by swallowing 2 cyanide capsules. The Allies still displayed his body in the gallows for the witnesses of other Nazi criminal hangings. There is also the very famous Doctors' Trial, which was held between December 9th, 1946 and August 20th, 1947. However, they were very hard for people to come to terms with because of the horrible, inhumane experiments that people were put through. This trial consisted of 23 German physicians. They were each tried for doing experiments such as high altitude, freezing, malaria, mustard gas, bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration, bone transplant, seawater, sterilization, spotted fever, and experiments with poison. In the end, 16 of the doctors were given different sentences and 7 were acquitted. Unfortunately, many criminals escaped the country before they could be captured. The most famous of these was Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. He was a doctor at the famous death camp Auschwitz. He took this as an opportunity to do research on heredity, which always fascinated him. He tortured many of the inmates and even did experiments on dead people. He ended up taking some of the dead people's skin back to his wife, so she could make furniture out of it. In South America, he found other German officials who had vanished after the war. He avoided capture for 34 years, moving around South America, first in Paraguay, then Brazil, and finally spent the rest of his life near São Paulo, Brazil. In São Paulo, Brazil, on February 7, 1979, while swimming with his family, he drowned and was buried under the name Wolfgang Gernhard. In 1985, German officials who had never given up trying to find him found the grave, dug it up, and ran DNA tests, proving, in fact, that it was Nazi fugitive Joseph Mengele. The world's justification for the Nuremberg trials was an understandable feeling that those in charge needed to be punished for their role in committing crimes against humanity, even though these criminals were civilianized. Those charged in these terrible events and their role in the war and treatment of other humans needed to be found guilty in proceedings that were conducted in a legal and formal manner in a direct contrast to their behavior. Their guilt of charges needed to be conclusive and clear. The immediate result of the Nuremberg trials were 24 people were put to death, 128 people served various times in prison, and 35 people were acquitted of all charges. The long-term effect of these trials was to change history and establish a world court, a court based on the understanding that evil people should be punished for their crimes against humanity. Even though many people criticized the trials, it gave the feeling of relief knowing that the people who were in charge of killing millions were getting what they deserved. It also brought the world closer because it found itself working together against all the crimes that took place and might take place in the future.